do want to welcome you to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting to discuss the Keegan Bayou feasibility study. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Flood Control District to share vital information with the community. My name is Sheldra Brigham. I'm with the Flood Control District's communications team. I'm joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we continue to keep you up to date on these important flood mitigation projects in your community. We're also joined by staff from area elected officials' offices and community associations. We're glad to see the community so engaged in these projects, and we look forward to continuing to share updates and keeping you all in the community involved. First, we would like to begin tonight's meeting with remarks from Harris County Precinct 1 Commissioner Rodney Ellis.
I'm Commissioner Rodney Ellis. Thank you for joining tonight's meeting about the Keegans Bayou feasibility study. The study's goals and objectives were developed with the help of community stakeholders and historical flood records. Tonight, we want to hear from others in our community because this project is being designed to protect your homes and businesses. Every community, regardless of income or race, should feel safe when faced with flooding, the most prevalent natural disaster in Harris County. Amen. Nearly 5 years as your commissioner, I've used equity as a guiding principle to bring flood relief to communities that historically have been neglected. In 2018, Harris County adopted equity guidelines for flood control projects to ensure that we prioritize communities that are most vulnerable to flooding and that often take them longest to recover. Your inputs on this project are very important to us. On behalf of the Flood Control District, thank you again for your participation tonight, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellis. We appreciate you joining us for tonight's meeting. This virtual meeting will begin with a presentation to share project updates, including an overview of the Keegan Bayou feasibility study, the project timeline, and next steps. The presentation will be followed by a virtual question and answer session with Flood Control District team members. Attendees will be able to submit comments and questions through the website and by phone. Any comments not addressed during the Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the close of the comment period. Instructions on how you can participate in this virtual meeting are included on this slide. They're on the virtual meeting webpage and on the Flood Control District website. And I'm going to share a reminder of these instructions when we get to the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting. We will now transition to Gary Bezimick, Feasibility Studies Department Manager with the Flood Control District. He's going to share some more information about the Flood Control District and then more about this particular project. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Sheldra, and a special thanks to each of you for joining us. In this presentation, we will give a brief overview of this project. Before we get to the project specifics, we want to share some information about the Flood Control District. The Harris County Flood Control District is a special purpose district created by the Texas Legislature in 1937 in response to devastating floods that hit the Houston area in 1929 and 1935. The Flood Control District is governed by the Harris County Commissioners Court and works closely with other entities in our region, such as Harris County Engineering Department and the City of Houston. The organization was created in part to serve as a local partner to leverage federal funding for flood damage reduction projects. Our mission has expanded since our founding, leading to billions of dollars in federal, state, and locally funded infrastructure improvements in the ground. The mission of the Harris County Flood Control District is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. One of the most difficult challenges we face is constructing effective projects that are sensitive to community and natural values in a highly urbanized area. Harris County includes 22 main watersheds, totaling approximately 1,800 square miles and more than 2,500 linear miles of channel. 2,500 miles is approximately the distance from New York to California. A watershed is a geographical region of land that drains to a common channel or outlet. Each watershed has its own unique characteristics and needs. The project we are presenting tonight is in the Brays Bayou watershed, located in southwest Harris County. Harris County is flood prone. Here are some reasons why our area floods. Our area experiences extreme rainfall, including tropical storms and hurricanes. Our area is flat with slow draining land, and the underlying soils in much of our area are clay soils that do not soak up excess rainfall quickly. While the Flood Control District plays a critical role in flood risk reduction, we are one of several entities involved in these efforts in our region. When rain falls on your roof, it flows through several jurisdictions, such as streets and drains managed by the Harris County Engineering Department, a municipal utility district, or a city, such as the city of Houston, before it flows into a larger channel, creek, or bayou that the Flood Control District owns and maintains. This slide illustrates the various jurisdictions, which sometimes we even share with other entities. Inside neighborhoods, as shown on the left side of this illustration, storm sewers and roadside ditches collect stormwater runoff and start the process of moving it away from streets and homes. Storm sewers and roadside ditches are the responsibility of the underlying municipality. The larger bayous and channels that take the collected stormwater and move it through our drainage system to Galveston Bay are the responsibility of the Flood Control District. This is shown on the right side of the illustration. In the middle is a stormwater detention basin, sometimes constructed by the Flood Control District. When storm sewers on the left are increased, this creates an increase in runoff. Since it is our policy to avoid impacts to properties downstream, detention basins help to safely take in and temporarily store excess stormwater during heavy rain events. Often we partner with Harris County precincts, utility districts, and others to add recreational amenities such as trails to these basins and along our channels. On August 25th, 2018, Harris County voters approved $2.5 billion in bonds for flood risk reduction projects. This vote followed a series of meetings across Harris County in each watershed, which resulted in a list of what is now 181 bond projects. As of August 2021, all 181 projects have been initiated, including 10 of the projects in the Brays Bayou watershed. A total of more than $1.35 billion in partnership funding has been secured so far to stretch the 2018 bond program even further. The actual timing of each individual project will depend on a variety of factors, including environmental permitting, right-of-way acquisition, and utility relocation, and in some cases, requirements of a particular grant. That said, project lists and projected schedules are updated regularly on our website. While the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project in the bond tables is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects in the bond program. As I mentioned, we've had some success so far, having secured more than $1.35 billion in partner funds. And this graphic illustrates the many sources of those partnerships, including federal, state, and local funding that the Flood Control District is working to secure for Harris County. Each agency has its own definition of eligible projects and its own requirements for local match funding. So the Flood Control District works diligently to match projects to the right partnership opportunities. We will now move into the part of the program that is specifically about the Brays Bayou watershed and the Keegans Bayou feasibility study. The Keegans Bayou feasibility study goals and objectives were shaped by historical flood records and community feedback. The main goal of the study was to identify flood-prone areas and their respective causes of flooding. There could be more than one cause of flooding, so our job is to correctly identify them to recommend appropriate short-term and long-term solutions. The sum of the recommendations and their phasing plan is what we call the feasibility study plan. We studied the entire Keegans Bayou subwatershed, which makes up 19 square miles. We modeled all open channels, which includes the entire Keegans Bayou main stem channel, shown on the map in red, as well as 8 tributary channels, shown on the map in yellow. Based on our observations of the historical flood records, physical attributes of the terrain and the channel network, and the results of the models developed for the purposes of this study, we noted several areas of concern. 1, there are multiple areas, sometimes spread across entire neighborhoods, with documented historical flooding. The largest concentrations of historical flooding are identified in purple line work. 2, the floodplain of Keegans Bayou is widespread, and there are areas where water leaves the subwatershed and enters neighboring watersheds. In doing so, the water sheet flows across some Keegans Bayou neighborhoods and causes flooding. 3, there are segments of Keegans Bayou that have low capacity, and this causes riverine flooding when Keegans Bayou spills out of its banks. And lastly, we noted roadway flooding is often deep and causes impacts to mobility. Our model results were calibrated using the known records at 3 rain gauges on Keegans Bayou for multiple storm events. We then used the results of the models to determine the channel capacity for all channels that we modeled. Channel capacity is defined as a measure of a channel to carry flow before spilling out of banks and flooding areas. The channels with the best capacity are represented by the green color, and the channels with the worst capacity are shown in red. We noted several segments of Keegans Bayou that lack capacity, including the large segment near the Beltway and US 59. We also noted that several of the tributary channels have the capacity to carry the flows they are intended to, and therefore increasing their capacity would not be recommended in attempting to solve the nearby flooding issues. To completely solve extreme event flooding, we need approximately 3,500 acre-feet of detention and a lot of land for constructing stormwater detention basins. If we are to represent 3,500 acre-feet of detention as a 10-foot deep stormwater detention basin, this hypothetical basin would be the size of the green box on the map, which occupies approximately 1 block from Beechnut to Bissonnet and from Willcrest to Derry Ashford. However, Keegans Bayou is densely developed, so it becomes challenging to find opportunities for detention. As a result of this constraint, in the interest of the public, we investigated the Ruffino Hills landfill, identified on this graphic in purple, for its detention potential due to its large footprint. As many of you know, this is a landfill that belongs partly to West University Place and partly to the city of Bel Air. It has been out of commission for approximately 30 years. It is important to note we performed a hydraulic exercise to determine a flood reduction benefit, assuming that the site is viable for detention, but we have not collected any environmental data or performed any testing at this time. To tackle the flooding-related issues described on the prior slides, we identified 6 study areas to be evaluated in detail to determine their potential to reduce flooding. Study areas 1 and 2 in the west include construction of regional stormwater detention basins in undeveloped parcels along Keegans Bayou. If successful, these basins are intended to help reduce the risk of flooding in the neighborhoods between Derry Ashford and Eldridge, and the large pocket of flooding identified closest to them. Study areas 3 and 5 in the east near Beltway 8 include construction of a stormwater detention basin and adding storm Beltway 8. If successful, they are intended to provide flood risk reduction in the 2 pockets of flooding separated by Beltway 8. Study areas 4 and 6 are improvements along the lower reach of Keegans Bayou. Study area 4 consists of improvements to a tributary channel north of US 59. Study area 6 consists of large-scale improvements to Keegans Bayou from Brays Bayou to upstream of Willcrest, and this option relies on Ruffino Hills. Beyond the 6 individual improvement options, we looked at adopting a feasibility study plan which is a sum of the best performing options, which include study areas 2, 4, 5, and 6. As part of the feasibility study plan, we recommend a sizable channel modification project along Keegans Bayou to increase channel capacity and reduce the size of the Keegans Bayou floodplain. It is important to note that the plan requires a large volume of stormwater detention storage so that channel conveyance improvements are successfully mitigated. We need something of the scale of Rufino Hills, and therefore Rufino Hills is part of the feasibility study plan. The plan also includes the projects from study areas 2 and 5, so as we move towards accomplishing these two projects in the short term, we get closer to achieving the feasibility study plan as well. The total cost to construct the entire feasibility study plan is estimated to be $190 million. This is the potential benefit map for the feasibility study plan, showing the potential benefit of accomplishing 3 miles of channel improvements and completing the other complementary project elements such as additional stormwater detention basins and storm sewer lines. We are looking to achieve 2,400 acre-feet of total stormwater storage. In comparison, to solve the entire Keegans Bayou extreme event floodplain, we need 3,500 acre-feet. With the feasibility study plan fully realized, the likelihood of flooding is significantly reduced for an estimated 1,637 structures, shown here in red. Significant additional structures benefit by seeing a reduction in depth and frequency of flooding, and those are shown here in yellow. The benefit of the feasibility study plan is sizable and widespread across Keegans Bayou. While the feasibility study plan largely depends on Rufino Hills, the Rufino Hills conversion into a stormwater detention basin, if this is not realized, we developed an alternate plan that relies on 850 acre-feet of storage. Therefore, if Rufino Hills is not feasible and we proceed with the alternate feasibility study plan instead, flooding would be significantly reduced for up to 750 structures, shown in red on the slide, and additional structures would benefit, seeing a reduction in depth and frequency of flooding, as shown here in yellow. The largest of the 6 recommendations and the most impactful part of the feasibility study plan is the Study Area 6 project. Study Area 6 include widening the main Keegans Bayou channel from east of Beltway 8 to upstream of Wild Crest. Here's a close-up view of the benefited area with Study Area 6. The flood risk is expected to be significantly reduced for 700 structures, shown in red. Additional structures benefit because of reduction in depth and frequency of flooding, and they are marked in yellow. The Study Area 1 and 2 projects explore the potential benefits of providing stormwater detention basins for safe storage of floodwaters to reduce the risk of flooding between Eldridge and Derry Ashford. Our exploration concluded that the Study Area 2 project is more beneficial than the Study Area 1 option, and thus it serves as the westernmost recommendation of this study. The Flood Control District already owns some land that can be incorporated into the Study Area 2 project and can also utilize a parcel of land that belongs to the Texas Department of Transportation. This project also allows for partnerships with the City of Houston. If the city were to improve neighborhood drainage, they could use storage from the stormwater detention basin proposed as part of Study Area 2 project for mitigation of drainage improvements. Here is the close-up of the Study Area 2 project and the estimated benefits. We estimate that up to 400 acre-feet of detention could be realized at this location, providing a significant reduction in flooding risk for up to 267 structures. These structures are shown in red. Additional structures also benefit by seeing a reduction in flooding depth and frequency. These structures are showing in yellow. The total estimated cost of achieving 400 acre-feet of detention is $33 million. However, with the land we already own and being adjacent to the TxDOT parcel, we can achieve 130 acre-feet of detention and remove floodplain from up to 126 structures at an estimated cost of $14.2 million. This shows that the plan for the area is flexible. Not all the assumed stormwater detention basin storage has to be achieved in order to build a project that is beneficial. The study areas 3 and 5 projects explore the potential benefits of providing stormwater detention basins for safe storage of extreme event sheet flow or overland runoff caused by the sloping terrain to reduce or fix the concentrations of historical flooding that are located here. Both study areas are adjacent to the Beltway and near Bell Elementary School. Due to existing topography, adding regional detention in Study Area 5 was more effective than Study Area 3, and thus Study Area 5 serves as the easternmost recommendation. Given that the stormwater detention basin storage would be provided close to the concentrations of neighborhood flooding, this also allows for partnerships with the City of Houston. If the city were to improve the neighborhood drainage, they could use the proposed stormwater detention basin to mitigate those improvements. Here is a close-up view of the benefited area. We are aiming to achieve up to 275 acre-feet of detention, which would significantly reduce the flooding risk for up to 195 structures, shown here in red. Additional structures are benefited by seeing a reduction in depth and frequency of flooding, and they are shown in yellow. While the total cost of the project is above $30 million, we have the flexibility to build a phase 1 of the project, resulting in 100 acre-feet of detention and flooding risk significantly reduced for up to 127 structures. While every flood risk reduction project is unique, they all have a common life cycle. Each project begins and ends with common and predictable milestones along the way. Whether a project moves forward from one stage to the next and how quickly depends on many factors, including the availability of funding, shifting community priorities, and other changing circumstances from year to year. As you can see in the project lifecycle graphic, we have completed the feasibility study stage. Typically, one or more successful projects that are identified during the feasibility study effort move into the preliminary engineering stage. As for the next steps, it is recommended to pursue projects in the feasibility study plan, as well as acquisition of right-of-way based on funding and opportunity. All projects selected for the feasibility study plan add value and work together to provide significant benefit to the Keegans Bayou communities. Specific to this feasibility study effort, study areas 2 and 5 are ready to move into preliminary engineering to be further developed. They were found to deliver considerable flood protection benefit, and phase 1 of both projects can be funded through construction using the available bond program funding of $30 million. Additional funding is required to realize all projects that comprise the feasibility study plan, and additional funding opportunities will need to be explored. I will now turn the program back over to Sheldra to kick off the question and answer session.
All right, thank you, Gary. Before we get to the Q&A session, I do want to share a quick reminder that we'd love to hear from you on this and other projects that are moving forward across Harris County. To learn more about this project, to ask questions, and to sign up for our mailing list, please visit hcfcd.org/F-07. Now, as a reminder, there are 3 ways that you can submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F-07, or you can submit a comment via phone. And that number is 855-925-2801. You'll want to utilize meeting code 6301. And if you are joining us via phone tonight, press *7 to leave a message. Additionally, I do want to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the public comment period. Information from this meeting, as well as a recording of the live stream, will be available on the Flood Control District's website, and you'll also be able to find that on our YouTube channel. Now, joining Gary for our Q&A session tonight, we have Nasia and Dina, who are overseeing efforts on this project. And now it is time to take some of your questions. First question will be for Nasia, and that is, what is the next step for this project?
Right, and so that's a good opportunity to summarize the basic takeaways of tonight's meeting. As you saw earlier, we evaluated multiple options to reduce flooding risk throughout the Keegans Bayou watershed, and our feasibility results indicate that projects 2, 4, 5, and 6 show promise in being able to do just that. So the sum of those projects is what we are calling our feasibility plan. Because that plan cost significantly exceeds the bond money that we have, one of the steps that we want to take is make sure that we are pursuing partnerships and funding opportunities when they become available. And also in the short term, we want to go from feasibility stage into the preliminary engineering stage with 2 of the projects that were also mentioned, that's projects 2 and 5. Because we estimate that phase 1 of both of these projects can be funded through construction. And they do a good job of delivering flood protection in 2 areas that need them. And so they're good standalone projects to consider further. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasia. Next question is for Gary. How is the study being funded?
Yes, well, as we talk about with the slide up right now, the project life cycle, we've just completed our feasibility study. So in the 2018 bond election, a $30 million project was approved by voters for us to study the Keegans Bayou watershed. And that $30 million is actually being used to fund the feasibility study, also being used to do all of the remaining tasks to go from PER to right-of-way acquisition to design and ultimately to construction. So the feasibility study is really kind of our attempt to study the watershed, identify, as I talked about in the presentation, what the problems are, where the problems are, what the source of the flooding is, and then to identify items that we could do, projects that could be done that would reduce the flooding. So as we do the feasibility study, we're trying to look at a balance of what can we do long-term to build towards, but also what can we do today with the $30 million that we have that will provide immediate flood benefits. So everything we've been doing so far is funded from the $30 million. And as we talked about in the presentation, we will continually be looking at other funding partners, whether it be grants, local entities, to try to figure out those gaps. But while we're doing that, we've identified projects that we can move forward with immediately that will start the process of reducing flooding in this watershed.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for Nasia. How will channel modification and stormwater detention basins reduce flooding in the area?
Right, so as you saw earlier, the number that we identified as the total number we would need to solve the entire extreme event flooding in Keegans Bayou is 3,500 acre feet. We can't go as far as achieving that much storage volume because the area is very densely developed, but we are looking to build in strategically detention throughout the watershed near the most critical areas. So what's currently happening is water is pooling inside neighborhood streets, impacting private property, affecting commute. And what we would rather do is have a safe storage of flood water inside an excavated piece of property that is then controlled, released back into a receiving channel. So that's one method that we're using to solve flooding. Another is channelization. And so what we are also looking at is potentially channelizing up to 5 miles of Keegans Bayou in the lower reach near the areas where the Beltway and 59 crossings are. That's the narrowest portion of the channel on Keegans. And for that, we also need sizable detention to accompany the channel improvements so that we can successfully mitigate any impacts of that work. But when you channelize, you're basically increasing capacity. And so that lowers the water in the channel and reduces the chances of channels spilling out of banks and causing widespread flooding.
Thank you, Nasia. Our next question is for Gary from Dan. Is this study only looking at the flood control aspect, or will you also address other area improvements such as adding more bike trails?
Yes, that's a great question. Really what we're trying to do in the feasibility study is develop a watershed plan, identify what we can do long-term and short-term. And in doing that, we identify what tracts, parcels of land we want to try to go after so that we can build the infrastructure that we need to safely reduce flooding in this watershed. So at this stage in developing the plan, we've now kind of laid out an idea of where our projects would be, what property we need to acquire. And so as these projects move from feasibility into PER, and we actually start looking at specific designs for projects to come and be constructed, that's the point where we start interfacing with others to say, okay, what are the needs in this area? And as we design the project, are there things such as hike and bike trails that could be incorporated into our design? So all of those steps will be coming. They're add-ons, if you will, to the degree that once we know what we need and once we know what our plan is, then that opens the door for us to be able to start looking at how we integrate some of that. But ultimately, our job as flood control is to identify what can be done to reduce the flooding. And so we look for partners to work with us on some of those other multi-use opportunities. But that does get done as part of the future design process.
Thank you, Gary. Next question is for Nasia from William. Will the bayou be dredged from Huntington Estates Drive to Dairy Ashford? There are 3 large islands that have grown, blocking parts of the waterway. In addition, there are 3 large drainage pipes that are crushed, as well as a sinkhole.
So I want to say that there are plans for dredging. I don't know the exact limits, so I would rather we respond back separately on this question after the meeting. I have heard of a dredging effort. I just don't know the details.
Okay, thank you, Nasia. Next question will be for Gary from Jackie. Approximately how long before any project starts?
Well, we are immediately moving the recommended projects over to our PER team. So how long before the project starts, if you consider the PER and design and all that, we're starting immediately. But we still have to go through the preliminary engineering where we start the design process. We start looking at what's on the ground and how we would construct. And then ultimately we have to get any permitting taken care of and then finalize. So we're probably looking, and Dina might have a better timeline for this, but we're probably looking at about a 2.5 to 3.5 years before we would start turning earth. Now, in the case of the property we already own, some of those projects will move a little bit quicker, but in areas where we're having to acquire property, it's probably in that 2.5 to 3.5 year window.
That's right, Gary. That's a really good approximation. Because as you touched on, we do need to go through the steps of preliminary engineering and design. And during those steps, we gather a lot more detailed information, such as geotechnical engineering, detailed survey data, really detailed information about some of the utilities that are in place out there, just to make sure we know actually what's in the ground and how we can put the best design forward. And then to go ahead and start working on any of those potential conflicts. Especially utilities can be a big one there, that we want to make sure that we're not having any conflicts with existing utilities and having interruptions to services with the neighborhoods. So it takes a lot of work up front to be able to actually prepare those detention basins and get them constructed and in the ground. But this is certainly a very important project to us, and we are moving it forward quickly. And if I could just circle back a little bit, I think 1 or 2 questions ago, there was a gentleman asking about dual uses and if we were looking at how we were looking at some of these projects and if there'd be room for other types of uses. And we touched on the fact that a lot of that really takes place during the preliminary engineering. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we typically do need to rely on partnerships with that, but we have a variety of partners that we often work with. That can be from the precinct to the city. It could be some sort of recreational organization. So there's usually a lot of opportunities to work with folks with that. And a lot of the times, the way we start moving into the design for our facilities, there is room to work with others and accommodate those other types of dual uses. So if there's something that you feel is very important that should be considered, or you know of a group who might want to partner with us or provide some input as we move forward into PER, please feel free to shoot us a note, leave that comment, let us know what you'd like to see out there. We'd really like to hear that input from the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I do want to give a quick reminder for folks who may be just joining us on how you can submit a comment or question during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site near the box, in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website, hcfcd.org/F-07, or you can submit a comment via phone, and that number is 855-925-2801. You'll utilize meeting code 6301. And if you are joining us via phone tonight, remember to press *7 and leave us a message. Another question coming in, and this one will be for Nasia from Wayne. What is the cost? What is the cost of feasibility to date?
Right. So I've just pulled out the exact numbers, and to date we have invoiced about $496,000 on this effort. But we're very close to finished, and final report is coming soon.
Okay. Another question for you, Nasia, from Thomas Gonzalez. Are you coordinating with Metro on the redevelopment of the Belfort Park and Ride between Beltway 8 and US 59?
Right. So beyond just Metro, we have been coordinating with a lot of agencies, a lot of groups. And so this is another item, yes, that we are hoping to coordinate with them as well through this effort and as we move forward into PER.
Thank you, Nasia. Next question is for Gary, and it's from Wayne. If Rufino Hills is further studied, what would be the schedule for the study to occur?
I think I'm going to ask Nasia if she can fill some of that in. We're still pretty early on at the Rufino Hills site. There's still a lot of environmental work that needs to happen. A lot more testing and things. So what we did, I'll talk about what we did, and then maybe Nasia can help with a better timeline. But what we were looking at in the feasibility study is saying if we were able to obtain the footprint that the Rufino Hills site is on, what could we do from a flood damage reduction perspective? So we've evaluated that, if that amount of land were available to us, here's what we could do, and here's how many homes could benefit. And we presented that in the slides. But there's still, a lot of work that needs to happen to determine if, relocating the landfill so that we have the detention area, and all those steps are going to need to happen. So Nasia, if you could help out with that.
Right. Yeah. So what we've scoped into our study effort was basically to look at it hydraulically. If it were feasible, how much benefit can it provide? And so the reason for that is we didn't want to duplicate work effort that was already taking place by a different agency. This site is being seriously evaluated for environmental impacts. They're doing, City of Houston is doing borings, collecting data to really look at the feasibility of converting it into a detention basin. And from our end, what we were providing is really those hydraulic numbers. Kind of, if we can get this much detention, then we can do this much channel work that to accompany that and to provide flood reduction benefits. So a lot more work is going on behind the scenes by the City of Houston. And so those results are pending.
Okay, thank you, Nasia. Got a couple of comments that I can share. First comment was from Mr. Verma, says the Keegans Bayou feasibility study team has conducted this task methodically. My comment is that The current allocation of funds from the bond should be used to buy the required land and right-of-way for future flood control projects on Keegan Bayou. So that was a comment from Mr. Verma. We appreciate that. Also had another comment as well from Stephen with Neighborhoods to Trails Southwest. So saying their organization would be glad to work with Harris County Flood Control District on dual use aspects like trails. Good deal. Thank you for those comments. Please keep those coming in. Our next question will be for Dina. And just to kind of give folks a little bit of background, can you explain exactly what is a feasibility study and how that works?
Sure, absolutely. So we'll pull up the slide here. You'll see in our project lifecycle, feasibility is shown as the first step towards identifying and constructing a project. So during the feasibility study, we will typically go in and do a lot of investigation of a site. We'll look into what the history of flooding's been, understand what the causes for the flooding has been in that area, and then start identifying ways to address it. So when you saw some of those maps up earlier that Gary was showing, where we saw a lot of inundation in different neighborhoods, we'll start investigating those types of things. And a lot of times we'll also go back and we'll look at data such as flooding records or complaints that we've received for those neighborhoods. We'll talk to folks who do work out there and really try to start understanding what's going on, and then start looking at the physical aspects that contribute to that flooding, and do a lot of data collection, and actually a lot of engineering goes into the hydrology and hydraulic calculations to start simulating what actually happens when we start having different storm events moving through town. How does water tend to pool and collect in these neighborhoods? Is it able to make its way into the storm sewer network? Is it able to make its way into the channel systems? You know, if not, where's it getting stuck? Is the flooding coming from some of those overland sheet flow issues that we touched on earlier? Or is it because of the conveyance capacity along the channel? So really looking into those different types of aspects towards the flooding in the area. And then once we have a better understanding of what's contributing to it, making those recommendations for how to address it. And then it's those recommendations that come out of the feasibility study that identify projects that we recommend to move forward with preliminary engineering and then into design and construction.
Thank you, Dina. We're also getting a couple of questions. Yes, we will have meeting materials from tonight. Those will be available on our website, as well as a link to the video. So you'll have access to be able to go back and watch this presentation in the video format, and you'll also have access to the meeting materials as well. Our next question is for Nasia from Lene, and who would be responsible for moving the damaged soil at Rufino, the seller, or the city, or the county?
So I think it's too early to speak on those details, but I would defer this question to Dina, just in case she has had more conversations with the city on the topic.
No, I agree with you. I think we're way too early to know the details like that. So, you know, please just watch for updates, and as that moves forward, more of that detail will come forward. But I think additional evaluation is still needed to really determine what the next steps forward would be with Rufino Hills.
Good deal. Thank you. Another question for Nasia from Patricia regarding Rufino. Why doesn't the flood control district look at conservation issues with restoring prairie in a section of it, native trees and grasses, retain water, and help alleviate flooding too?
Right. So in general, I think we're getting better at using detention basins as an area that is also environmentally adds a lot of value in communities. And I'm not an environmental engineer, so I can't speak on how all of that works. But there are many examples throughout the county where we have made a lot of effort to make sure that those detention basins also have a thriving environmental areas that provide kind of refuge for native plants and different species to thrive. So in the case of Rufino Hills, there is always a conversation about how to utilize that site ultimately, so mixed use, and it wouldn't only serve as a detention base necessarily, although I don't know the details, but there's a lot of conversation about how to best utilize that site. And of course, there could be more than just a single purpose for Rufino Hill, but it's too soon to speak on that, I think.
Thank you, Nasia. Another question for you. When did the study start and when does it end?
Right, so we're typically on a 12-month schedule. So we started in the fall of last year, and so we're getting ready to wrap up with both submitting the final report, some of that will be online, and also collecting community feedback. So we're getting close to being done.
All right, and another follow-up question to see, we're going to keep you busy. Are there other examples of successful landfill conversions into stormwater detention basin?
And I understand the interest in Rufino Hills. It is a very interesting concept. So we did look into it a little bit, and some of the numbers and things that we use sort of as an estimate of what it might cost to do this. We realize there are other examples out there, and one that's comparable to this is in Maryland, in Cecil County, there is a landfill that was converted to a stormwater detention basin. So kind of similar to what we are talking about here. And then we also stumbled upon another example in Oregon, Bend, Oregon, where a landfill is being remediated to over time become a 128-acre site for a college campus. So there are other examples. We're not the first, and there is hope in getting it done right.
Thank you, Nasia. All right, Gary, wondering if you could go over next steps for us again, and for folks who may have joined us late and didn't get a chance to hear that portion.
Sure. Next steps are really we're wrapping up probably in the next month our feasibility study, and that just means that we're putting our final report together that documents our feasibility study plan, and it also documents all of the alternatives that we have evaluated. And as part of that, there's a recommendation for 2 projects to move directly into the preliminary engineering. Those are projects 2 and 5 that we presented on today. And they're kind of, for reference, 2 is on the western portion of the watershed in Harris County, and 5 is more on the eastern side. Both of those evaluated were projects that if we can build the detention, in the case of 2, we already own property out there, and we would like to expand the footprint. In the case of 5, we would need to acquire some of the property. But both of those are projects that the more land we can get, we've determined the more benefit that we can hold. So we can start immediately, and for almost, not quite literally, but for every scoop of dirt we take out, there's benefit that we're going to realize. So those projects were identified as immediate. And then in addition to that, we have some major efforts to do improvements along the main stem of Keegans. And those projects require large detention. That's where the Rufino Hills site came in. As we've evaluated it, as I said earlier, hydraulically, as if it were available and we had a land that was sized as Rufino Hills, what could we do with it? What kind of benefits? But there's still a lot of work that needs to happen between us and the city to determine, what would it take? What's the permitting process? What's the funding costs and all of that. So right now, as we talk about next steps, is immediately projects are moving directly into the design process, the PER process, so that they can be constructed as quickly as possible. Additional to that, we have team members at the district that are continuing to look for funding opportunities to expand the footprints of what we can do. And then in addition to that, we also have teams that are going to continue to coordinate and look at topics such as Rufino Hills that really are more of a long-term solution. And so we have short-term things happening, we have intermediate things happening, and we have long-term. And we will continue to do that until everything gets constructed. So that'll just be ongoing efforts.
Thank you, Gary. We have a question for Dina. As funding becomes available and projects are identified, can we expect more community outreach?
Yes, you definitely can expect more community outreach. And so that's going to happen a couple of ways. We'll have active meetings, such as the one you're in tonight, to learn more about our project as it moves through the project life cycle. But those will be a lot more targeted and focused on those specific projects. So in Gary's presentation, he talked about a project in Area 2 and a project in Area 5. Moving forward, it'll likely be that we have independent public meetings for each of those projects. That way we can focus and have more detail to share with you and more direct conversations specifically about those projects rather than watershed-wide based projects. So we'll have more information about that during preliminary engineering, and then as we move through the design phase, so that we can go ahead and keep the community updated and share information about our projects and answer questions. But I'd also like to point out that we update our website regularly as well. And that's a great resource if you want to learn more about these bond projects we talked about tonight, or any of the other projects included in our bond program. We update them at milestones along the project life cycle, and provide quite a bit of information about, study findings, or what's the latest update is with the preliminary engineering study and things like that. So it's also a really good resource if you're curious about some of our projects in between those community meetings that we have to share information about them.
Good deal. Thank you, Dina. I just want to give you one more reminder. We're going to go a few minutes over 7:30, letting you know how you can submit a comment. You can do so in the comment box near the presentation live stream. We're hoping to get a couple more questions from you. You can do so on our website, hcfcd.org/F-07. Or you can submit a comment via phone, and that number is 855-925-2801. There's a meeting code. You'll need to utilize 6301. And if you are joining us via phone tonight, you'll press *7 to leave a message. As those questions and comments continue to come in and we're not able to get to those, you will receive a response from someone at the Flood Control District after the close of the public comment period. Right, so we have another question for Nasia. And what is the total funding needed to construct the entire feasibility study plan?
So we estimate 170 to 190 million. And the reason for that variability is the uncertainty around the Rufino Hills. It's estimated right now based on some preliminary borings that most of that waste is municipal waste, and that it's relatively easy to handle the cleanup of the site. But because of that uncertainty, there is some variability in the cost. So the price tag is pretty large.
Good deal. Thank you, Nasia. Next question is for Gary. Gary, can you recap the 6 study areas again for us?
Yes, I'll do my best. So study areas 1 and 2, as you can see on the graphic, are in the western part of the watershed. Study areas 3 and 5 are on the eastern portion of the watershed. And study areas 4 and 6 are kind of right in the middle. Study area 6 is really the biggest component of the study area projects that we looked at. It entails channel improvements, channel modifications along the main stem of Keegans Bayou. And that's the project that requires a large amount of detention storage. So what we're really doing there is trying to pull in the floodplain, provide more capacity along the main stem on project area 6. But in doing that, as we talked about, we cannot push more flows downstream that potentially flood somebody. So we have to pull the water into the channel with the bigger capacity and then store it somewhere. So that's probably the biggest project out there. Project study areas 1, 2, 3, and 5, I'd consider those more regional. There's problem areas that we identified as part of our study, And so we were evaluating projects that were smaller scale that could be done that are more related to stormwater detention and conveyance than doing large scale channel work. And so these areas, there's floodplain that floods people. And if we can get the stormwater detention added, you know, for every acre foot, we pull water that is going into neighborhoods. And so as a recap, I believe it's study areas 2 and 5 are the two that we're recommending to move forward. But as we find, you know, additional funding, we'll continue to look and refine these plans and try to just expand the footprints on, you know, each of them as much as we can based on available funding.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap, but I'd like to share one final reminder that we are continuing to accept comments and feedback on this project through September 14th. So please let us know what you think. We also encourage everyone to get flood insurance, as we know that flood season in Harris County is year-round. So we always like to issue that reminder at the close of every meeting. Do want to thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Gary, Nasia, and Dina for being excellent presenters and getting your questions answered. And thank you all for joining us this evening and for all of your engagement in this project. Have a good evening.